Hi, I'm Phil Lowe at the Furniture Institute of Massachusetts, and this is The Art of Woodworking. What I'd like to do today is to do a little commentary on wood and how it's processed. You know, when you walk around the community and you see a bunch of houses that are made out of wood with beautiful columns and balustrades and so forth like this, these are all people that at one point in their life had to learn a trade that was very, very complicated, and you know, they added so much to our lives with this beautiful decoration that it really is an amazing feat of humankind. And they did it with tools like this. And what I'd like to do today is to bring you through a number of these different types of tools and a little bit of the history of the tools and the process of how they processed some of the wood when they came here and started taking this raw product from the forest. Now, this is one of the real primitive things that they used to use when they went into the forest in order to cut down trees. Now, when they first came here, the really interesting thing about it was they brought technology of tools and so forth from England, and they also knew the product to go after when they first came here. And that first product that the Pilgrims used was the oak tree. And one of the reasons for that was it not only was beautiful wood, but to harvest it, it was the best wood because it was easy to split. So you've got to imagine that they went into the forest with these huge, huge oak trees, and they'd have to chop them down with an axe. And this thing falls over. They have to then drag it out of the forest and then cut it up into small, manageable parts in order to, get the parts for furniture or houses or whatever it might be. So one of the things that they would do is they would have to, get manageable pieces to size, and then they would have to split it in order to make it into manageable parts. Say, for instance, I wanted to make a leg for a chest with 3 panels in it. What they would do is they would have a couple of implements. One, a big old wedge, and or what they call a froe. A froe is actually a wedge that has a long handle on it, and when you drive it into the edge of the board and drive it down, you have this leverage in order to split the wood open. So when we go to do that, if we actually make a couple of cuts like so, just to get a straight line. Now I'm going to go down to the floor over here. And then we're going to go ahead and drive this wedge all the way through here. And that splits the log in half or into quarters. And then if I wanted to make a leg for a chest of drawers or something like that, I would do it again. Oop. All right, now we have a piece that we can use in order to make some sort of a leg out of it. I'll get rid of some of this excess stuff. Now the next thing that they had to do is they had to process this somehow, get it smooth and so forth. So there was different types of tools that they used in the old days in order to do that. Now a couple of them that you might want to look at are these planes here. Okay, these are 3 of the planes that would have been in any one of the woodworker's toolbox. We have a smoothing plane, we have what they call a jack plane, and then we have what they call a jointer plane. And a jointer plane is for doing long flat surfaces. The jack plane is used to do some of the rough work, and the smoothing plane, or what they call the coffin plane, is what they use to do some of the smoother cuts. Now, in order to process some of this as well, they had to use another plane that I only have a contemporary one of, which is what they call a scrub plane. And a scrub plane is a plane that is very, very narrow, and it has quite a heavy curve on the blade. And what this does is this removes material quickly, and it's the forerunner of the thickness planer. I'll show you how that works. So this would be held somehow in a bench with a dog. It's what they call a bench dog. It goes into one of these holes, held between the vise, and then this is pushed across here. What you'll notice, what you're going to notice here is that these are big, heavy, thick shavings that are coming off of here. Let's get rid of some of this stuff. And what that does is that allows us to smooth the surface relatively quickly. Now, if I had to adjust this, I'd get myself a hammer. You know, a hammer like this or whatever, and if you tap on the end of the blade, that's going to make a little deeper cut. Now, a couple other things that they used to do besides splitting wood was to saw wood with a pit saw. And a pit saw is actually a saw that is used. As you can see, a pit saw is actually, the log is actually pushed out over a hole that's been cut into the ground, and then they have a pit saw where there's a man that's standing up above on top of the log and a person down in the pit. And that's probably where they got the saying, "You're in the pits." And, you know, they're actually, you know, cutting these pieces into boards. And then they also used a frame saw. You know, this was the standard type of pit saw that they started with, and then they moved on to these frame saws that were used in the pit saw as well. And once they were able to cut a board, they'd end up with something like this. You know, big piece of wood that's been cut. You have the wane on the side, so in order to make these manageable pieces, they had to cut them to size somehow. So, you know, we have to introduce another tool here, which would have been called, you know, a handsaw. We have two types of handsaws, one that cuts across the grain and the one that rips with the grain. So once we have the board cut into a slab, you know, you can see this is what they call the wane, which is actually the curved part of the tree. And, you know, this isn't very useful, so this would need to be cut off. So in order to reduce this piece to the size that we need in order to make a piece of furniture, we use these different types of saws. This happens to be a rip saw, which has a really heavy tooth and is arranged so that they have a set in it and they're very chisel-like. And then we also have a crosscut, which is a much finer tooth, and when these are filed, they're actually filed on the diagonal. And I have a nice little graphic in this old book that I have. So this is the cross-cut arrangement of the teeth, where they come to a point, like so. And then we have the rip saw, which has the teeth filed straight across, which makes them more chisel-like. And this is used to cut with the grain, and these are used to cut across the grain. So if I was trying to get a part for a piece of furniture out of this particular board, I might need to, I'll use these two saws like I explained to you, one for ripping, one for cross-cutting. So I would need to, first of all, get a dimension of what I want. I want to make sure that I take care of getting rid of the wane, so I'm going to just put a line on here. Get that good and straight. And if I happen to need a piece that's, say, 16 inches long, I'll give ourselves a little extra. And we'll bring a line across here as perpendicular as we can get it. And then we want to get a width. Let's just say we need 6 inches. And we'll make that parallel. So this is the piece that we're actually going to try to save. So first of all, what I'll do is I'll take a crosscut saw, which is this fine tooth saw, and we'll cut across the grain right on this line. Now, what I've just cut is what they call a kerf. And the kerf is made by the teeth, and the teeth are actually bent from one side to the other, which they call set, which will allow the saw to guide through there easily, and you're able to steer the saw ever so slightly with the set. Now I have to rip this, and ripping is going with the grain. You'll notice that the teeth on this are really huge. This is what they call a 3.5 pointer. So for every 3.5 teeth, you know, it's 1 inch. And we're going to cut this along here. All right, there we have our part. Now we'll also have to rip this along this line here in order to get the width that we need. Okay, now that I have this board cut to size, you'll notice that the piece, of course, is quite rough on both surfaces. And one of the interesting things is the saw mark that's left from the ripping. And if you look at some antique furniture, a lot of times what you'll find is the telltale marks of the builder that will be left on the edges or on the surfaces of the pieces. And that's what I really love about antique furniture, because it's so human. It's got all the telltale marks of a human actually touching this piece of wood. So the next thing that we really need to do is to use that scrub plane again to get rid of this surface. And but before we go any further, what I'd like to do is just show you the comparison of some of the tools from the old days and some of the tools that we use today. So I already introduced you to the scrub plane. The scrub plane, like I said before, is actually used to get rid of the roughness, which would just be sent across like this. And what's interesting about that now, if you run your hand across there or actually feel that surface, we have some very huge undulations that go across the surface because of the curvature that was left by the blade. And these are scallop marks that go across the surface of the board. Now, in order to get rid of these, to make it smoother, we use what they call a jack plane. The jack plane is the next plane that would use over the surface. And this is usually a 12 to 16 inch plane, somewhere around there, 14, 16 inches. And it's used to take some roughness of the scrub plane marks off of the surface. And then we would move on to what they call a jointer plane. And one of the interesting things about all of these planes are they function in a way that you can almost equate them to a boat in the ocean. If you have a small little boat and it's going in and out of the waves, the plane is going to go in and out of the waves like this. Whereas the supertanker, which is going across the ocean, is going to hit the top of the waves and it's going to, ride much smoother. So if I have an undulation in the board or an angle or a twist, the joiner plane is going to hit the high spots and get the board much flatter. So what you'll see with this we're starting to get a little bit more of a shaving now. And what you're going to notice is the surface becomes quite flat and smooth. Okay, so now that I've introduced these four types of planes, I just want to show you, this one here and talk a little bit about the history of planes. Planes have been around for, centuries. They actually have found some Roman planes at Pompeii that dated back to the 4th century AD. And I don't know how old this one is, but as you can see, the shape of it and so forth, it's seen a hard life. But it's probably an 18th century plane from what I can tell because of the blade, the type of wedge, and the handle that it has. And in the evolution of planes, one of the interesting things about it is that they started to make planes, well, let's put it this way. Plane technology hasn't changed in 1,000 years, or it hasn't changed at all. I mean, the idea of you having a wedge shaped blade held into a block of wood that you can run across the surface to take a plain shaving or very delicate cut, that hasn't changed at all. Even with the contemporary planes, the wedge is always being held at a 45-degree angle, and the only thing that really has changed is how it adjusts, and I'm going to show you that now. Okay. Now, I talked a little bit about how the plane works, holding the blade at a 45-degree angle. And the only thing that really has changed is the fact that they designed a way to move the blade in and out with ease. And what I mean by that is they actually were able to figure out a mechanism. It was a guy by the name of Bailey that figured out that he could make this casting with this little yoke on the end with this turn knob that would allow the blade to go in and out smoothly, so you don't really have to tap the blade in order to make the depth of cut that you want. So it makes it a lot easier. And one of the things that a lot of the tradesmen resisted was the fact that they didn't like a completely metal plane. So they designed a plane with this wooden bottom on it. And this is really no different than this jack plane. So this is the evolution of the jack plane. So we have the jack plane with the wedge, then we have the jack plane with the mechanism for the adjustment, and then eventually they went to completely all metal, which are these three here. So this is the real transition from this style of plane had been around for thousands of years. This one here has only been around since the 1860s, 1870s, somewhere around there. And then, of course, these newer planes are, made of cast. Now, these are probably from the 1930s, 40s, somewhere around there. And then we also have, a real contemporary plane, which is this one here, made by Lee Nielsen up in Maine, actually. And this is based on one of these old Stanley type planes. Okay, so I'll show you how each one of these work. They're basically the same. You know, the jack plane just goes across the board the same way. And the metal plane is no different. So there you have it. You know, that's how we smooth the surface of a board. I'm going to bring over a few other planes. I'm going to lay them out here so that you can see the progression of planes that they used to make in the after the 1860s. Okay. Now, what I'd like to show you now, this is a full set of planes. You really don't need to have every one of these if you're a woodworker. Basically, 3 of them are the ones that you need. And those 3 particular planes are the number 4, a number 5, and then a 7 or an 8, and I like the 8 myself. All of these other planes are just different types of planes that they thought they could make just to sell and make the job supposedly a little bit easier. Some of them have some definite design features that really you know, help out. Now, for instance, if we look at all of these different planes, they start at a number 1. This is a fairly rare plane right here. It's, as you can see, it's quite small, and it's you know, probably designed more for a child or more of a, I guess, a novelties type of plane. When you go up into the number 2, you know, that's a little bit more, you know, a bigger size, and they probably would have been used in the schools for, you know, industrial arts classes for, you know, kids that are, you know, 8 or 10 years old, somewhere around there. Then we have a number 3, and basically you almost grow along with the plane. You know, as the student get older and a little larger and bigger, you know, they would have a plane. Now, couple of the things that are the difference here is these couple of planes are basically the same length, but the width changes slightly between the 3 and the 4. As you can see, they're a little bit wider in size. So what that does is that actually makes the blade in the plane a little wider, so that when you plane it, you actually get a little bit narrower or a wider shaving that's a little flatter. And then they have a number 4.5, which is basically the same, but again, it increases the width, so you end up with a much flatter cut. And then we go into the 5, which is one that we use for roughing, and this one has quite a curve on the blade because we're trying to just remove the material as quickly as we can. And then the 5.5 is again, just a wider plane so that you have a wider cut. And then we have a 6, which is just a little bit longer. Sometimes they call this one a panel plane as opposed to a, you know, a jack plane. And then the 2 joiners, again, the difference between these is this one's a couple of inches longer than number 8, and it's a little bit wider than the 7. So those are the real differences of these planes. So, like I say, these are the 3 that we will probably use over and over again. And if you're going to go buy tools, you know, the 4, the 5, and the 7 or the 8 are the ones that you're after. Now what I'd like to show you is some of the European style planes. They're what we call infill planes, and what they mean by that is they're surrounded by metal, but the interior of them is actually wood. And this one happens to be some coca-cola in the middle. This one happens to be some rosewood, and I think this one is actually some English walnut. Now these are these 2 particular planes this one was made by Matheson, and this one here was made by Spears. So those are popular names over in England. There was also another type of plane by the name of Norris, a Norris plane. This particular one is a specialty plane, which is used for cutting rabbets or, you know, along the edge of a board, or for trimming up tenons and joinery and so forth. So, you know, these are very specialized tools. This one, again, is a panel plane or a 4 plane, and it's, you know, it's quite heavy. It's got a lot of bronze, a lot of steel, and, you know, once you get this thing moving, the inertia really helps you when you're actually making a cut. So those are interesting ones to look at, and if you ever come across, you might like to grab one if you can. Now this is an interesting plane. I happen to bring this one out because of the shape of it. You know, the craftsman that was working with this particular plane really, as you can see, you know, probably loved this thing to death because of the, you know, ornamentation that he put onto it. You know, you have this nice cutout here with some, you know, some smoothing here. That's probably where he was holding his hand. I think this little knob on here is an add-on, as well as the striking pin on the back. But you look at the handle, you know, it's nicely shaped, and he's, you know, made a nice little cut on the inside here, and he actually did a little, you know, rose carving on the wedge here, and it's been painted black, and it looks like it had some red stripes on it. And I think this sole was added on later on when they needed to close up the throat. But you know, you can come across some of these specialty planes occasionally, and the craftsman really adds, you know, his own flair to these things. I have one other one over here too that I'd like to show you that was made not just recently. This is the one that I was just talking about. This is what they call a Krenoff style plane, and James Krenoff was a furniture maker out in California and taught at Fort Bragg, one of the colleges out there. And he was a Swedish guy, and he brought this style of plane over from Sweden. And you know, it's really quite a you know, a nice little plane. It's designed for doing a lot of smoothing. You can almost, you know, just take the surface right off of this. You can see that the shavings that come off of this are extremely fine. To a point where they actually will float to the ground. And if you had the ability to touch this, you couldn't get this any smoother than what that edge is right now. I mean, some of the Stanley planes can be adjusted to that as well. I mean, if we back off on this knob a little bit and start making a cut going across here, and then push the blade out until it starts to get a cut, basically this is the same shaving that I can get off of that plane, where those will float. Look at this, so static they stick to my hand. So the nice thing about this one, much easier to adjust. Again, this one is a little finicky. You have to tap it with the hammer in order to make a deeper cut. Strike it on the back in order to draw the blade back inside. Okay. So the next plane I would like to introduce you to is the plane that really changed woodworking. This one here is called the plow plane, and what I mean by that is it plows a groove. And a groove is a channel in the surface of a board that they could slip a panel into. And it wasn't until they invented this plane that the chest with paneled sides and legs and rails and stiles came about. They could also do wall interiors with raised panels, you know, to create an entire wall. And the beautiful thing about this is you could make a frame structure with rails and stiles and then fit these panels into it to take up as much material or much space as you want. Now the plow plane, if you'll notice, it has a blade in it, and basically it's a chisel. It's a chisel that's being held at a certain angle so that when you pass it across there, it's basically you know, controlling the depth of cut of a chisel. So if I have a chisel like this and I want to cut a groove, you know, I have to go like this. But the beautiful thing about this particular tool is it's held in place. It also has a fence, which we have here, with a couple of wedges that hold these beams in place. So if I knock these loose, I can move this from side to side to get whatever dimension or wherever I want the groove to be located. I'm able to do that. And the beautiful thing about this is I can run this right along the edge here. Grab this here. Run that along like so. Now this tool has a stop on it. This little brass knob that you see on the top will control a foot that's in here that will only allow the cut to go so deep. Okay, now the interesting thing about that groove is if I have a panel that has a tapered end on it, I can put that right inside of the groove, and that'll make myself a panel that could be decorated with carving, or it could make up a wall unit. And that's one of the interesting things about this particular tool. It really changed the woodworking and how things go together tremendously. Now I'm going to show you some other specialty tools that they used to use in the old days as well. This is pre-router, pre-electricity. So let me grab a couple of those. What I'd like to do now is to show you some of these specialty planes. And these specialty planes came about when they started to add moldings and so forth as to the edges of boards and so forth to make things look more decorative. Now, a couple of those planes, they call them hollows and rounds, and one of the what that means is one of them will cut a concave section into the edge of the board, and the other one will do the opposite. Will actually cut a quarter round on the edge of the board. And this would, with the combination of a couple of different types of these, you would actually end up with a decorative molding on the edge. And you can see I got a couple of them here. Two of them are relatively narrow and the other two are relatively wide. Now, some of these are actually used for doing the shoe of a chair, which is where the splat goes into the back rail. And some of them are used to do big cornice moldings around or on the top of a highboy. So some of the other tools or planes that came about as well is some of these simple ones. This is a simple beading plane, which is interesting because it was designed not only to cut a bead, but if you cut the bead and you go in the correct direction of the grain is not favorable, you can actually turn around and go in the opposite direction. And now these are interesting because they have these boxwood infills, which are extremely smooth, and they're shaped exactly to the same shape as the cutter. So when we run this across here, we'll actually put that right up against the edge and run this across. We seem to be going with the grain. Once in a while they get a little clogged, so you got to clean them out. And once this has been cut, what you'll see here now is that it makes this nice little bead on the edge of something. So if you want to make a little half round around a drawer, or if you're making some paneling and you want to have a bead running around the paneling, that would be done with a tool like this. Now, a couple of the other tools that I'd like you to show, or to show you, are some tools that are a little bit more complex. And what I mean by that is these are what they call molding planes. And if you can get a close look at this one here, you'll notice that it has a very complex blade with a concave shape or in the blade, and a convex shape in the blade. And those are actually going to cut the opposite. This will end up being a cove, and that'll end up being a half round and a little fillet on the side. Now, some of these planes are designed to be used on an angle. And if you look at the end of this particular plane, I don't know if you can see it or not, but there's what they call a spring line that is on the end of this. in that spring line is the angle that you have to hold the plane when you're actually making the cuts. So when I go to cut this on the edge of the board, I'll run this across, but instead of holding it upright like this, I'm actually going to hold it at an angle according to that spring line. And as I pass this across, the cut becomes wider and starts the quarter round. And now we're going into the cove. And the shavings are quite different than what you get off a regular plane. But the beautiful thing about this now is you have this complex shape that's all got cut in just, with one tool. This might be used as a molding on the bottom of a chest of drawers, or it could be, a molding on the edge of a tabletop or something like that. But you can see here how that actually matches up to the shape. Now, when these planes were made, they actually had what they call the mother plane, which was the opposite of this, in order to create this plane. Now, there's a couple other planes here that I'd like to show you before we go. We have this one here, which is a rabbiting plane. This was probably used to make raised panels, which is, I love this one because it was made in the shop. You can tell because the chamfer on the edge here is all, you can feel the facets from where the maker actually left the chisel marks. And, this got this big C-scroll on the edge of this, which is, just really unbelievable. Not a great piece of wood. He had used something that was just hanging around. It actually has a knot on the end. And then we also have this rabbiting plane, which is used to cut across the grain. Now, this particular plane has what they call a nicker in it. This nicker actually will score the wood ahead of time so it won't tear out. So when I go to actually cut something like this, if I clamp a fence on here, let's get say we want it about like that. Let's see if we can. We'll hold that in place with a clamp. Now we have to hold that down to the bench good and firmly in order to pass this across. And now this nicker will cut across the grain prior to the blade cutting. So we should be able to, I guess we'll get that out of the way a little bit. Oh. And we'll go ahead and pass that across. Now this is leaving a nice clean cut because of that nicker cutting in before the blade actually cuts. And now they realized that if they put the blade on an angle as well, that it would actually cut much smoother. Whereas if it's going straight across, it has a tendency to tear out and make it much rougher when you're cutting across the grain. So if I was to make a raised panel or to make a panel or a drawer bottom or something like that, I'd want to cut the rabbet on the edge. So again, it fits into a groove that, that you'd make it mate to. So a couple of planes, last planes that I want to show you are, there's a couple other, these complex planes. This happens to be an OG. So again, it's, it's just a little bit softer than the last one that I did. But a couple other things that I'd like to show you is this one here. I really like this particular plane because it really shows you the craftsmanship that it took to make this plane. You can actually see the scribe lines on the side of this plane that the maker scribed on there in order to cut out the angle for the blade to go through and the mortise for the wedge. And this particular plane is used to make rule joints, which is sometimes you find a tabletop that collapses on itself and has a quarter round. That's what this particular plane did. Now, most of these planes, you'll find that they have names on them. Like this particular plane here has, this belonged to W. Gregory, and it's a 5/8 inch wide OG plane. But this was the owner of the plane at the time. And let's see, F.W. March most likely was the manufacturer of it. So, right in itself, it has a little bit of history, stamped right into the end of it. Now, this is the last little plane I want to show you. Again, it's a shop-made plane. This particular plane was done by cutting a couple of 3 pieces or 4 pieces to a certain thickness, and he made his saw cut in the internal piece and then glued pieces onto the outside, and that's what you see these lines are all about. And this is a great little tool because it's cut such a small little OG shape that it was really designed for extremely delicate work. Okay, I'd like to thank you for spending a little time with me. Hopefully I took a little, demystified some of these tools and what they were used for. And hopefully we'll see you next time here at the Furniture Institute with the Art of Woodworking. Thanks, I'm Phil Lowe.